Like I said, welcome. This is our third event in the Mitigating Bias in Analytics series. The first event we had was around data collection. 2 weeks ago, we hosted a panel around design, and today we're going to be talking about policies and standards. And we're going to be joined today by Kendra, who I will introduce very shortly. So thanks again, Kendra, for being here. Real quick before we get into the good stuff, just a few administrative items that I want to go through. So the agenda for today, we have an introduction of WIA and Tableau. We'll get into our discussion with Kendra. We'll do some Q&A at the end with the audience. So as you think of questions, please throw them in the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we'll get to those towards the end. And then finally, we'll close things out, show you how to find the recording to this session if you want to watch it again or share it with your colleagues or friends. And then the last 20 minutes after this webinar, we're going to have an optional networking session. So you should have received the link, and I'll talk about that a little bit more too. So this Mitigating Bias in Analytics series is something that WIA started about a month ago in partnership with Tableau. It is a free virtual series that includes panel discussions, fireside chats, and we discuss ways to basically identify and mitigate bias in the analytics process. So we have one of these every other Wednesday, so keep an eye out for upcoming events as well. And they are free and accessible online. A little bit about WIA. So our whole mission is to increase visibility to women making a significant impact in the analytics space, and provide a platform for women to lead the conversations around advancements of analytical research, development, and applications. We just launched a membership program, so if you're interested in being more engaged with our community, feel free to check that out on our website. And then I'm going to pass things over for a second to Lilia, who's our partner with Tableau.
Hi, thank you so much. I just wanted to jump on real quick and say thank you so much to WIA for running this series, excuse me. We're really excited to be a part of it. In my role at Tableau, I am passionate about advancing the visibility of women and underrepresented voices in tech and in analytics. So we are feeling the vibe with this analytics, Mitigating Bias in Analytics series, and we're really excited to continue to be a part of it. If you're not familiar with Tableau, which I would hope most of you are, we help you see and understand your data. That's our short and sweet mission statement. And if you're looking for more resources, on our community page as well, we've got a plethora of free resources and so many different tools that folks are using to explore data and mitigating bias. And we also have other women in analytics events running on our website as well. So feel free to check that out. Thank you so much for letting us be a part of this, and I'm excited for the session today.
Thank you so much, Lilia, and thanks again to Tableau for supporting us during this series and partnering with us on this. Some quick webinar tips: if you're having audio issues, send us a chat, use the email there. If you have a question, like I said, there's a Q&A portion. You can enter in your question there at any time. If you're ready to participate, we do have a poll for you, so keep your eye out for that. And again, if you're up for some networking, stick around with us afterwards. Now to get to the good stuff. I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Kendra. Kendra is the Vice President and Data Science and Product Development at Sparks and Honey. Kendra captains a team of technologists focused on using data to quantify culture and power the transformation strategies that build better companies and better futures. Kendra has spent over a decade working for New York-based marketing and consulting firms, as well as on a few product startup projects of her own. She has worked on a host of different clients, ranging from CPG companies like Procter & Gamble to high-tech clients like IBM, as well as household names like Starbucks, AT&T, and the New York Times. Kendra speaks regularly on the intersections of diversity, inclusion, and technology. Welcome, Kendra. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm
of course.
Looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me too. And I know, like I said, this is our third event in this series. So what I want to do is start off with a basic definition of bias and what bias means in analytics from your perspective.
Whew. Okay, so big question, right? So bias takes a lot of different forms, right? But ultimately what it is it is a deviation from representation, right? So if we think about everything being kind of reflective of the world around us, that would be kind of perfect representation. Bias is whatever happens in between that perfect representation and then what we actually have at hand that we're likely using to fuel our, in our case, often algorithms, our programs, our whatever work we are doing. And so bias is not necessarily intentional, but it is an imperfect reflection of the world around us.
I absolutely love that definition because I think, if you work in the analytics space, you know that what we're constantly trying to do is understand the complex world we live in. And one way we do that is trying to capture the information and make sense of it and try to make conclusions so we can do something with it. What the definition that you gave really shows how some of that might be skewed. Perception has a lot to do with it. People who are involved in that process have a lot to do with it. And I know that you run a team of data scientists. So I'm interested in understanding how, how you hire and ensure that those types of skill sets exist within your team, and two, how you train on ensuring that they can watch out for things like bias and detect it properly, and in their process of building analytics and algorithms, they use the right techniques and methodologies.
Sure. So I'll handle these kind of one and two, right? So in terms of hiring, there are a few different ways that I kind of probe for mindset, right? Like, so first, my job is to quantify culture, which is a huge and heady task and also ridiculous and impossible and amazing. It's the coolest thing that I think I've ever done in my career. And so what I tend to look for is the intersection of somebody who's deeply creative, but also deeply interested in the kind of fundamental statistics that influence all of our processes, right? And so you want somebody who is that kind of perfect mixture of interested in building something that they haven't necessarily, that doesn't have a roadmap, that they haven't necessarily built before, but also somebody who is very rigorous and is going to do a lot of thinking at all points in the process, right? So and then there's also the fact that I happen to be a queer, non-binary femme who is Black. And so that tends to come up a lot of times when we are interviewing. So conversations around identity and conversations around how I approach the work typically come up, maybe not the first interview, but definitely in the second. And we also tend to run an interview process where not only are people meeting with data scientists and other technologists, but also we tend to interview with at least a couple people outside of our department as well, to get a sense of, how this person is going to handle not only the actual applied problems that we're talking about in kind of the day-to-day, but also some of the larger organizational problems that we face, because ultimately our jobs as technologists is to take these wild and complex things that, in my case, typically like strategy consultants come up with, and then codify them into actual technology. But it could come from anywhere, right? We exist to, in part, solve business needs, or rather to solve business needs in a pretty huge way. And so definitely probing for that competency too has been really helpful for us. And in terms of kind of how we address bias in our day-to-day work, I can kind of rewind a few years to an underlying principle that we brought into the work when I first started the job, and when I kind of started the team, right? So, and that was this idea that we are inevitably going to have bias in what we are doing. It's impossible to escape. And so our job then is to, at times, introduce additional bias in different directions to kind of counteract what we have going on underneath. And at times it will be to mitigate. And so it's to stay mindful at all points, really, of what is what data do we have, what data and how that is going to be influenced by how it was collected, by whom it was collected, and then also how it compares to that larger world that I kind of spoke about already. How is this reflective or not reflective of what's going on beyond that kind of selection bias that we're inevitably influenced by?
Yeah, and we were talking beforehand too. Bias can be a rather ambiguous topic, and so to kind of ground this into some more specifics, specifically for our listeners too. You mentioned keeping track of who's collecting the data, how it's collected. This entire process. Do you have specific tools or techniques? Like, is it a Google Doc that you're keeping track of all of these things? Like, what does that look like on an execution level?
Yeah, so I mean, it looks a couple of different ways, right? So the system that I have had a large hand in building over the last few years is something that we've built from scratch. And so one of the things that basically the kind of core behind all of it is that we have a trend taxonomy that we use, which really could be anything, right? It's a taxonomy. It could go a number of different ways, but we have individuals who have said, okay, so this is a trend that I see showing up in the world, and here are different places that I see it. And so basically our job is to take kind of human input and then codify that in models that can identify these things on an ongoing basis. So it matters a lot who actually decided what, the trend data divinity was, right? If it was, one intern who collected, 1,000 different ways that this particular trend shows up in the world, then that is going to be biased in the view of that one person, right? And so one of the ways that we try to counteract things is by making sure that like no one is actually at this alone, and that we have multiple people with multiple points of view involved. One of the kind of early career situations that I found myself in probably about 10 years ago was we had a relatively junior person who was brilliant and amazing, who did all of the research behind and did all the insights gathering behind what we wound up showing to a client around kind of room decoration and what kinds of rooms people were most interested in decorating in their houses. And because she happened to be in her early 20s, it just did not occur to her in any of her research and any of her work to think about children. And so that was just children, and their existence was completely left out of what we actually looked into, all of the data that we were digging through, and we didn't realize it until we were in front of the client. And the client was asking, like, I'm really surprised that like we don't see children's rooms showing up in the spaces that people like to decorate. And, we kind of danced in the moment to be like, okay, like, why could this possibly be? And then had to go back later and actually update the research a bit to say, okay, so, it didn't shift tremendously, thank goodness. But, this is the kind of thing that happens when you have one person who's kind of wholly responsible for everything. It certainly wasn't her fault. It just did not occur to her, given her life experience, to ensure that her data set should be larger. And so creating a system of checks and balances kind of started at that point, right? And so everywhere I've been since, we've made sure to have at least a few people involved, and ideally much more than that, right? And so how do you, as best as possible, ensure that you are having people who understand the data and understand the world, who are contributing to the underlying data sets that we need to actually build these algorithms? And how do you make sure that you are, as best as possible, ongoing kind of checking to see how this lines up against, one, your expectations, but two, how the world actually operates outside of your organization? Because we too often get deep into our own data and don't necessarily reference that back to what is actually happening outside of our organizations.
Yeah, I picked up quite a few things from that, and I love the way you laid that out, and that example is also an excellent example. It brings up a couple of things in my mind. Number one, culture. There needs to be a culture of being able to find each other's blind spots, and openly do that and be cool with it, because I feel like that's a lot of, there can be a decent amount of ego involved in these types of initiatives. And so that's one thing that resonated with me quite a bit.
Yeah.
The second was process. I mean, you're talking about putting a process in place where you ensure that during the quality components, like quality assurance piece, before it goes out in front of the client in production, whatever it is, there is a standard process in place. You cannot move past go unless you do this, which I'm not sure that many companies have or are enforcing properly.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that that is likely the case. So process is something that I both am not like naturally given to. I am kind of a harebrained creative in my heart and soul, and all of my project managers would happily tell you that. But I do tend to work really closely with people who do over-index tremendously in process. And so what we've kind of done, at least for our case, is like create what is kind of I mean, it's the, if for lack of a better way of putting this, like a bastardized scientific method, where basically what we do is we, make sure that we are building out hypotheses and that we're testing against these hypotheses, and that, we are at various stages kind of vetting things as we iterate, because the truth of the matter is, like, not all data science is valid or helpful. And not everything actually, improves the results of what we're looking at. And so, we need to be honest at every point. And definitely you mentioned ego. We need to foster this environment of egolessness as much as possible, where like we have some ego because otherwise we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. Otherwise, like, we wouldn't have the confidence to execute against our jobs. But also, we need to be able to share issues that we're having early and often. We need to be able to discuss things openly, because we are making judgment calls at so many different stages of the process, and those judgment calls make a huge difference, right? Like, you are going to get, you're going to build an algorithm, you're going to build a model that is, wildly variable or wildly problematic if you are using too little data, or too much data, or data that doesn't actually reflect what's going on underneath. And both the promise of AI and of machine learning, but also the downfall of it, is that it makes it really easy to reenact mistakes over and over and over and over really fast. And so you quickly wind up in this world where you made a small judgment call early on, but now against millions of records or more than that, you've reinforced that initial bias as well.
Yeah, for sure. And you start to think about what happens when we continue to automate a lot of these processes with AI, and how that can get wildly out of control. And it's interesting too, you mentioned the scientific method. I find that a lot of organizations, at least early on, had a baseline requirement that you must have a PhD to be a data scientist. And I feel like it's still true in some organizations today, but my hypothesis around that is because they loved the person who had experience and the rigor around the research process. So to your point, like being able to go through the scientific method and define your hypotheses and state your assumptions and do that in a very rigorous manner.
Yeah, there's also just the fact that unless you are a statistics major, and not a ton of undergraduates are, like, you wind up getting out of an undergraduate program without a ton of statistics work under your belt, right? And so there is a lot of math that is required to understand good model selection. And so I think that has something to do with kind of the educational requirements as well. I will fully cop to the fact that I do not have a PhD. I, in fact, dropped out of a PhD program a number of years ago. But I also got into the field kind of early, before it was even codified as data science. We don't actually have any PhDs on my team, but most every data scientist that I work with has at least a master's. And that is in large part because when you have somebody who unfortunately has less educational experience, you don't necessarily have the years of statistical methodological learning that you get with higher education. And where that can be learned other ways, it's hard, and it takes a lot of motivation, and and it is certainly kind of a barrier to entry, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. Yeah, I mean, so I'm curious to go back to the automation piece of it. There's some tools out there that are claiming that they'll do auto like technique selection for you and auto feature generation. And there's even those same tools, and I'm talking about ones like Data Robot, for example. Those same tools are ones that say they will also do automated bias detection for you. So
Right.
what are your so is the problem solved, or like what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, anything that promises to solve all of the problems makes me deeply nervous, and that is as a as somebody who's kind of naturally skeptical, but also because it's hard to trust something that I can't tear apart myself. It's hard to trust something that you can't vet at every step because you know how the sausage is made here, right? And so you increasingly have these commoditized AI services, which sometimes they're incredible, sometimes they're amazing, and there are plenty of off-the-shelf things that I wind up using because, to be honest, it's better, faster, et cetera, than something that we've built in-house. But then there are a lot of things where if you're saying that something is going to automatically detect bias, what kind of bias? Like what are we talking about? Because it's awfully hard to trust that, knowing that literally every step of the game introduces some kind of bias. Like when we're talking about image recognition right now, there are all these studies that have pointed out that I remember reading this anecdote, I don't know, a couple of years ago, where this it was an unsupervised machine learning method, image recognition, where they trained on several hundred photos of men and women to try to apply sex to in this image recognition algorithm, right? And there are various problems already with this, but we don't need to go into that. But basically what wound up happening is they took all of these photos, all the photos of the men they took on a sunny day, all the photos of women they took on a cloudy day. And so when they actually, when they wound up trying to apply this, there were all sorts of errors, there were all sorts of problems. And then they wound up kind of tearing it apart, and they realized, oh no, the problem is that we actually introduced the bias at the beginning, because what the machine is picking up on is not, the human face at all. What the machine is picking up on is what's happening in the background. And those sorts of things happen all the time, especially with unsupervised methods. And so how can we even necessarily be sure that they're testing for the right things that we're looking for, that we know we're introducing? There are a lot of complications between there and here. And certainly there are applications where it works incredibly well and it's incredibly helpful. It just also really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, and how you've vetted it yourself. We do a ton of testing for everything side by side, just to make sure that we are picking for our particular data. And we work with tons of different types of data. We're picking the right set of models for this particular type of data and this particular problem.
Yeah, and it's funny because at least I've noticed, during every step of the process, I understand companies' desires to make this more streamlined and efficient, right? Because at the end of the day, they're looking at their bottom line. They're trying to figure out what part of the process can I automate, so that it's scalable, and because otherwise it's just not feasible financially. And so I get the incentive behind it. We've gone from having to program techniques ourselves to actual packages being developed in open source and being able to utilize those. And then that layer of abstraction kind of removes the user from the intricacies and details underneath these packages, for example. So this whole automation process it's going to happen, but I think it needs to be, in a direction where people still understand the underlying logic behind it.
Right. And that's always the danger. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so, as we start to get more into kind of this automation process, a big piece of this from a bias detection perspective comes around legal policies, right? And so we just spent a good amount of time talking about some standards that you can implement as a best practice as an organization, but how do you enforce these? Because that's where the hard part comes in. And it's one thing to make a case financially to do it as something you should just do, and also ethically is something you should just do. But then there's an enforcement component to it. So in the financial sector, they have they have pretty serious regulatory compliance. And so have you seen, any policies come up recently, or do you think that those same types of policies should be applied to other industries, or what's kind of your thought process around legal enforcement of these things?
Sure. So outside of finance, I don't know that anybody right now has particularly strong regulatory compliance and legal enforcement, but that's something that is likely headed in the directions of a number of companies. Right now, Facebook and Twitter and a number of other organizations are grappling with all sorts of issues, especially around the election, and around standards and policies for what constitutes certain kinds of hate speech, what constitutes certain kinds of biased language, et cetera. In what cases, how does this show up? And it's a really heady, really difficult set of problems to solve. I know that a few organizations are beginning to build out teams to start to think about tackling these problems. And it's really in, I would say, the early stages, right? I'm also aware the Internet Advertising Ethics Organization is working on for advertising, is working on compliance courses in the hopes that analytics people and data scientists within that particular sphere definitely have access to some additional learning, as well as potential accreditation for this particular way of thinking. But a lot of that is to avoid what will likely become legally mandated regulation and compliance issues down the line. So it's still in this kind of nebulous, we're trying to self-regulate world, and we've got a lot of people who understand a lot of the underlying issues, but also we are still wrapping our heads around just what the technology that we have available to us can do. And that's a difficult juncture to kind of be at this point.
Yeah, for sure. I think we're moving from a should you to like, can you?
Yeah.
Like, should you do this? I think people who are thinking of ethics first in their organizations, just culturally, they're saying, no, we should not do these certain things because they have a societal impact, a negative one. But I think eventually we're going to have to get to this, can you? No, like you could be sued. And we talk about some of these examples too, is empowering the people that it's affecting. How do you properly communicate the impact or the reasoning behind what the algorithm is deciding that's impacting you? So if you're applying for a loan, I think you do have the legal obligation or the legal right to ask, why was I denied for this loan? You have to tell me exactly. Mm-hmm. And, that should be the case for, why did I get this ad? But I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, we're not necessarily, right. And I worked while I worked for Hearst and worked for the advertising agency that they own. I was the kind of lead data scientist on their data management platform. And so I could actually see just how I had been tagged across the internet, and, what socioeconomic bracket I fell into, and, what my alleged interests were. And on some things it was really accurate, and some things it wasn't. And we probably should, much like you have GDPR in Europe, we probably should be able to ask, just exactly how are you categorizing me? But, is that necessarily enough? I jokingly, seriously say that, advertising is the social contract that we've made with the internet. We get the internet largely for free. We pay our internet service provider, but most of what we consume on the internet doesn't come at a cost to us. And the trade-off is that we have to look at ads, and the trade-off is that everybody tries to optimize and make more money, which means that targeted ads have become a thing, and then further targeting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so yes, we should probably understand what everybody has on us, but also, there is the other side of it, which is that like we need to start deciding like what should we be able to decision on and not, right? While it is supposed to be illegal to discriminate based on race or based on gender for loans or in lines of credit. It doesn't necessarily mean that in what we're building that doesn't happen. In part because all data is history. It's something that's already happened. And so when we're using the history of what we've done in the past, like the past often includes our biases. And so then we apply that going forward without necessarily counteracting that. So, you had cases last year when the Apple credit card was released of, women reporting that they got much lower lines of credit than their husbands, even though they have, joint accounts and similar credit scores. And so that's something that, we can't necessarily tear apart right now from the outside without a lot of work. And so how does that kind of communication back and forth become easier, where I'm certain that, Apple they didn't necessarily mean to do this. Like this was not their intention, without a doubt. The bad press alone was certainly not their intention, but it's what happens when you aren't actively kind of checking things at all stages and also checking to ensure that these biases aren't playing out in various ways. So definitely, you mentioned QA earlier, and that's something that without a doubt, we need to be thinking about more when we think about the ramifications of what we're building, because they decision so quickly and we don't usually know until after the fact unless we're extremely diligent. And unless we actually build time and make space to do that work, which comes with a certain amount of cost.
Absolutely. I was going to say there's two things that pop into my head with that statement. Number one, I don't know that data scientists are particularly trained in these types of testing techniques.
Sure.
In my experience, I've seen them be extraordinarily talented from the statistical side. But when it comes to building production level code or understanding kind of the rigor behind the QA process, I mean, in software, they've split those out, right? You've got your developers and then you have your QA, you have your quality assurance team. And once the developers deploy something, it goes to the QA team. And some of the larger organizations are starting to do that with data science as well. But some of the tests that they're running might just be, does this code function correctly? As opposed to, if we run this in a production-like environment for 6 months, what kind of bias could we potentially find?
Right. And, and then because we also wind up in this mindset that like the data is divine. The data is, the proof of what has happened. You wind up in a scenario where you're like, well, so far in the history of our organization, 95% of the people who have bought, whatever good from us are white. That means that we should probably, mostly market to white people. And that's not necessarily what happened. That is just what has happened to date. And so that's where it gets really dangerous, because the decisions that you've made already and affect your future decisions or your current decisions as they may be.
Yeah, and investing in gathering more data and differentiated data is also an extraordinarily expensive exercise.
It is. I mean, it's unfortunate, but one of the kind of, I would say, the biggest complaints that I get as a data scientist is just like, why can't you do this faster? And it's like, I would love to do this faster. I really would. But like, we also need to make sure that what we're doing is rigorous. What we're doing is, as accurate as possible. What we're doing is not introducing additional issues and problems, because once we do hit production, we're going to be, taking this relatively small data set, all told, these thousands of data points, or perhaps we have more than that. We have hundreds of thousands or a million, but we are going to be using this smaller data set to label things at a much greater capacity, to decision even more. And so the mistakes that we make, in the small term, like on the small scale, are going to be blown up in such ways that like will be extremely costly to counteract or mitigate down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. I start thinking about some of the more specific test cases and data that needs to be collected from a system perspective as well, and how that could potentially influence this. So a huge question that a lot of companies have is, what is the impact of this algorithm, right? They want to put an ROI on it. They're like, here's my investment, here are my costs, here's how much, our resources were, associated to this particular model. And then that model went into production and then did some things. And then there's some sort of revenue associated to that. And so that kind of impact analysis is already a big challenge, and there's a financial motivator underneath it. But I'm wondering too, if we can start to solve that problem, could that impact also include the social impact, and that be a metric of success for companies?
Yeah, I mean, and that is part of the question. Like, that's a huge question, right? Like, how do we move beyond simply assessing the financial impact and the immediate financial impact of something? One of the biggest problems of being a consultant in any way is the fact that a lot of the work that you're doing is not actually going to see the light of day for a year or two or sometimes more. And when it does, it will be related to what you did at the outset, but it will look a totally different way, right? So how do you exactly trace that back? How do you do that attribution? And it's a similar thing, it's quite complicated with anything that we're doing. Like, the immediate impact of this particular method, this particular algorithm is this, but what is the long-term impact, and how is this actually interrelated with all of the other things that are happening? It may be relatively small now, but it has a much bigger impact down the road, or vice versa, because that's really just how attribution works. Unfortunately, it's always tricky.
Yeah, and it takes a significant amount of thoughtfulness and design to incorporate and capture those types of metrics as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, because you put this code in production, it's this model running, and then you've got all of these systems of interaction, let's say with customers, and you have to determine, okay, what do we want to collect, and how do we tie this back, and how do we prove that our model made this change or made this thing happen?
Sure. And that's when you start thinking about, like, well, what actually are all of the different metrics that we care about, and how much when we're thinking about kind of mixed attribution modeling, do we care about, the direct attribution versus the kind of the grouped attribution, or the kind of, I'm blanking on the mitigation models that we've used in terms of a lot of our attribution models, but like rather than doing direct attribution modeling, we switched to kind of mitigated models a while ago, understanding that the world is really messy. We're not going to focus so much on breaking it apart, but we do care about these specific impact metrics that are not just revenue. There are other things as well, because it is a complicated world, and as best as possible, we are balancing various things simultaneously when we're thinking about what impact looks like.
Yeah, for sure. And what I find to be pretty fascinating too, I got my undergrad engineering degree, and we were forced to take an engineering ethics class. And they talked about negligence, and they talked about who's responsible. Like, if you were to design and build a bridge and it collapsed and killed lots of people, like, who's responsible for that? And there's this similar kind of conversation happening with AI, and specifically being kind of forced with, these automated cars. Like, sure. I mean, and who's responsible? And so, there's this kind of larger question too, not just is it accurate or not, but even if it is or isn't, the impact of that, who gets the responsibility of that?
Right, for sure. I mean, it's ultimately like you have the trolley problem, right? Which is a philosophical problem, an ethical problem at the outset, right? What you're dealing with is not engineering, or is not pure data science. What you're dealing with is, in fact, like grappling with the ethics underpinning, how should I make this decision? And, what does this look like in XYZ different scenarios, and then at scale? Because ultimately, when we get down to it, what we're talking about with automated vehicles is that people could potentially die. And how are we decisioning on what, what is and is not okay in those scenarios. How do we ensure that as best as possible, somebody of a different race shows up and is read by an automated vehicle the same way that, a white person is. We're reading, Black people the same, with the same accuracy, and thus decisioning the same way. Like it winds up getting into an ethical quagmire extremely quickly, because we also have, only tools that are only as advanced as they currently are, which is deeply, deeply concerning. But at the same time, like, the technology is moving so quickly. And so we have this kind of space race on the technological side, while simultaneously we're still grappling with like ethical questions that are in many cases hundreds of years old. And how do we ensure that everybody has that same ability to process, and the same kind of ethical underpinning, the same kind of morality, where they are making sure that this is affecting how they are approaching their jobs now. It's a lot.
It is a lot. And it makes you wonder, like, these people who are aspiring data scientists, like, they got to feel kind of terrified.
Yeah.
Like, at the end of the day, if that's the model you built, what are the policies within your organization on the impact of that? And
Sure.
and is it the data scientist's job to be an ethical expert and know what that is?
I mean, I don't know, right? Like, I would say that, like, it is the number one thing that I have to teach data scientists, especially entry level data scientists, is just the ability to think about and kind of process what the decisions that you're making are going to do, and what kind of impact they could potentially have. And then how to grapple with those moral decisions. It's not so much like, it's never about the kind of underpinning statistics. Like, they got that academically. It's always the kind of applied, and then how does this actually affect the world? How does this affect what we're trying to do? And how do you kind of carry that with you and carry that forward?
Yeah, it's funny too, because this topic has been specifically emphasized, I think, in the last year or two. I mean, it's been talked about for longer than that, but as far as being kind of the forefront of the conversation, I've seen the data science topics ebb and flow from being very science driven, like, we have lots of data, we need to figure out architecturally how to manage and process all of it, and then we come back to these very artful conversations about ethics, and it kind of ebbs and flows between science and art pretty significantly.
Always, yeah.
So we do have a couple of questions from the audience. So one attendee said, I have a serious problem with the word bias. It seems it was used rather than saying, for instance, racism or other exact words, as a way of hiding or not dealing with the real issues and problems. Do you have, thoughts or response to that particular statement?
Yeah, I would say that plenty of algorithms are sexist and racist and transphobic, and absolutely, like, that is, we use bias sometimes as a pared down way to avoid actually grappling with the fact that, like, we are making decisions that are making our world less equitable. So that, I would say, largely just agree, very much agree, and yeah, thank you for kind of calling that out. That's a thing that I should certainly think about, and we should certainly think about kind of as a larger body of humans who care about these issues.
Is there a difference in your perspective between the kind of conscious and unconscious components to that?
I mean, not so much, right? Like, intent, of course, like, intent matters to a certain extent, but it doesn't matter at all when you think about the impact. Like, it doesn't matter that, the intent was never to potentially kill Black people with autonomous vehicles when we've programmed them a certain way, when we've used certain data sets. But when you use inequitable training data at the outset, and then even before that, when you have cameras and software that can't detect dark skin the same way that it can lighter skin, fairer skin, like, it was never possible from the beginning. So why did we make these decisions? How did we get here? And, how can we now figure things out that when we are in this world where we have algorithms that are decisioning in like not just biased ways, but straight up racist ways, or sexist ways. I've worked in offices before where like you can't tell because of Zoom. I am not a particularly large human being. I am considerably smaller than the average man. I have worked in offices where, because they were extremely green, we had motion detectors that would control the lights, and I couldn't personally trigger them because my body was too small. So like, yes, like that is a huge problem, especially, you know, in a building, in an industry where like it was not particularly male dominated. But the technology that we had at our disposal was decisioning in a way that it couldn't read more petite bodies as existing. And so I couldn't control the lights. Like it doesn't really matter what the intent was when the impact is sometimes, often devastating and sometimes annoying, but the end result is the same. And that's a problem.
And that's what matters. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can start to talk about how did we get there. There's kind of two questions there. There's, you know, is it an issue? Yes, in all of those aspects. And then you can start to ask the questions, how did we get here? Because you want to start to fix that in some capacity. So a couple more questions from the audience. Outside of detecting bias, would love to hear your thoughts on what you can actually do about it in your analytics methods. We've experimented with matching techniques to control for age, sex, gender, race, and in analysis, but it's hard to say if we are doing enough with our work to really address the fact that we are missing populations in our data.
I would just say that like my general approach is just to start from a place of knowing that I can never do enough. So I start from a place of like assuming that I am deficient. And then as best as possible, I'm going to ensure that I'm accounting for the ways in which I know the larger world is deficient, because I'm certainly going to be amplifying those. And so I talk a lot, not so much in this forum, but in others, about how my approach to things is extremely intersectional and extremely feminist, very much influenced by Black feminists. And a lot of what that means for me is, as best as possible, as often as possible, centering the most marginalized and building to that. So how do I, as best as possible in what I'm doing, take kind of the most marginalized or the worst case scenario and build out from there? Because when you build to, it's kind of like, if you know, like the OXO products, the OXO products at all, those were designed as like can openers and other goods for people with arthritis. The founder's wife had arthritis, and lo and behold, and this is often true in product design, when you design something for, you know, people who have various needs and various kind of adaptive needs, you wind up typically with better products at the end of it. And so I try to bring that into my data science work as often as possible, understanding that unless I do that, I'm without a doubt probably introducing additional bias. So how do I, as best as possible, build to what is kind of the most marginalized or the most overlooked? Because if I do that, then I typically wind up in a place that is probably not wholly mitigating bias, because it's not usually possible given our collection methods, given, you know, the ways in which we process, given the tools that are available to us right now. But keeping that in mind, we can continue to readdress it, continue to assess it on an ongoing basis as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that exactly, because you're echoing a very, very, very similar statement in our last session. It was around design, and she said the exact same thing. So it's really interesting to see consistency across the conversations as well. We have another question. It says, what companies do a good job approaching, finding, and counteracting biases? Have you seen any examples of this?
I would say that I see examples in like various ways, various organizations that I'm trying to like, it's always hard when you're like, think of one organization.
Yeah.
I would say that there are various organizations that excel in like specific aspects of this, right? So you have, I mean, I like to point out Twitter a lot. Like you have, Twitter's really good at having kind of an open data policy. and as best as possible, kind of adhering to an openness that recognizes that there is a certain amount of bias that just inevitably exists because the world is biased, because the world is racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, et cetera. And that is going to get echoed and reinforced on their platform. And so they do a lot to try to build community and also try to, as best as possible, counteract it in a lot of their product, right? But recognizing that you can't entirely do that in a world that still has various prejudices. I would say that, there are a few financial organizations that are really kind of on the forefront of attempting this, but it's hard to call out a single organization as being like particularly excellent at this, because there are also so many different ways that it shows up.
Yeah, I think it's easy to call out the ones that aren't too.
Yeah, unfortunately, right?
Right.
Unfortunately. And that's like, but that's also, yeah, that's also difficult. But yeah.
Yeah, because those are the ones that are making headlines, when it goes wrong.
Yeah.
And so it is hard to learn from best practices when it's challenging to point out the ones that are doing it correctly.
Yeah. And I would say that, like, look to the people who are kind of trying, and often, like, sometimes it's the people who are kind of failing publicly, but failing quickly, and then kind of taking the feedback and coming back. Like, those are the people who typically are doing a lot.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point too. I mean, you've got a lot of these companies who have been in the headlines, like Microsoft, for example, and even Google, but especially around the facial recognition technology. But there is this element of the people at the forefront who are testing a lot of these things. They're going to be the ones to run into some of the problems first.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely a huge risk at some experimentation level of that. And to keep things moving forward, it's going to be really challenging for society to justify some of that in some cases, especially with autonomous vehicles, for example, because you have to experiment. It is the nature of data science. And so you have to see what happens and test things very rigorously. And some of those tests are going to have bad consequences.
Yeah.
And so I think trying to reduce that as much as possible and understand that that's unfortunately part of the process, is, I think, important personally. So I'm going to close out the session. I know this time went by really fast, and thank you so much for all of sharing your experiences and your thoughts and your knowledge with us. It's truly, your background's truly incredible, and just thank you for being a voice in this particular space.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Of course, yes. So real quick, if you were to recommend, some resources to the audience to continue learning, or how can they follow you, for example, on Twitter, or anything for them to kind of continue the conversation after this?
Sure. So on Twitter, and generally, it's Clark with an E, is the handle. So ITSCLARK with an E, because I say it a lot. But yeah, so that's probably the easiest way. And then in terms of some resources, so in part because I have done some work with them recently, the Internet Advertising Ethics Organization is doing some really interesting thinking. And a lot of that is kind of forward and out. So definitely check them out. Wally Snyder is the head of that organization, and really towards data science, and then a number of other kind of publications are doing interesting work in terms of thinking about data science and data ethics. And that's kind of where I tend to turn when I'm thinking through things and mulling things over. And I tend to point data scientists there quite often.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Real quick to everybody still on the line, I'm going to post the link for the networking session right after this. So if you do click this, it'll take you out of this webinar, just FYI, but copy paste it somewhere for when you're ready to move over to the networking session. And before we close out completely, I'm just going to share with everyone more information about the upcoming session that we have in 2 weeks with Noelle Silver. So that's September 16th. She is the founder of AI Leadership Institute and founder of Women in AI. And that is going to be specifically around mitigating bias in algorithms and the very specific techniques that I know that we've touched on briefly today. But she's going to be diving more in detail around what that looks like. So Kendra, thank you again so much for joining us. And, I hope everybody continues this conversation and continues the education process, because this is just such an immensely important topic.
All right. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.